sure we need those microphones?
Well,
I don't think we do.
we always do.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a bit of a lobby not to use the mics, but we do need them. We do need them. Okay. I've just gotten nods from the back. Well, I just want to say welcome to everyone and just quickly let you all know that my name is Mark Schulte and I'm the education director here. And it was my good fortune to be on tour with Will and Eleanor in February, where we did 25 events at middle and high schools in Chicago and here in DC. So they've been busy. They've done this talk a few times before. And the reason that we did that was because in the global marketplace, we Americans are the consumers. We're the shoppers. We consume far more oil, copper, coal, and aluminum than any other nation. And we love nothing more than to find a bargain on clothes and electronics. And the internet has made it really easy to find the cheapest goods, wherever they may come from. We obsess over how much things cost, but most of us probably don't know much about the raw materials that compose the stuff that we buy. And I think we often assume, or anyway we hope, that mining, logging, and drilling companies that operate globally do so in much the same way that they do here in the US, or in the case at hand, in Australia. That is to say, more or less fairly cleanly and safely. Unfortunately, that's not always true. Eleanor Bell and Will Fitzgibbon, who are two journalists with the Center for Public Integrity and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, did some digging into the subject. And they're here today to present their investigation into the practices of Australian mining companies in Africa. And if you think the news is good, you need look no further than the project's title, and that title is Fatal Extraction. Please join me in welcoming Eleanor Bell and Will Fitzgibbon.
Thanks very much, Mark, for kind words and introduction. So I'm obviously Will Fitzgibbon, and that's Eleanor Bell there. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. We are acutely aware of the fact that this is, in this particular city, in this particular country, let alone in the country that we come from or live in, that it's a bit of a niche topic. Australian mining in Africa, but rest assured, we can promise that you'll see some and hear of some issues that remind you of things, problems, topics, and controversies closer to home. So, without further ado, let's begin.
Sure. Maybe you'd like to, because Will actually initiated this investigation. He was travelling in Madagascar when he saw something that he thought looked out of place. And it's probably important to note at this point, Will is our Africa desk at the ICIJ. So he covers the continent, basically. So he was holidaying there.
I was. Yes, so I work with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which is a grand title for a small organisation that basically works with media partners across the globe on issues of global importance and with local media partners. So in this particular project, Fatal Extraction, yes, there was reporting and this presentation beautifully presented and done by Eleanor, but we also at the same time worked with journalists from 13 different countries in Africa, from a reporter who'd been imprisoned in Niger for reporting on corruption to one of South Africa's largest newspapers, who all at the same time did their own investigations and brought out their own domestic concerns as it related to the topic of Australian mining companies in Africa. So part of ICIJ's MO and its punch, we think, is working with newsrooms across the globe to ensure that undertold stories, such as this one, get a bigger hearing than they usually do. So my interest in all of this started not necessarily with being an Australian, but walking into a Madagascan regional airport once, many, many years ago, and being just dumbstruck by the fact that instead of seeing smiling faces of lemurs on posters everywhere, what I saw was wall-to-wall coverage of an Australian mining company proclaiming to visitors at this airport how wonderful its new titanium mine project was. Does anyone know what titanium oxide is used for in the mining industry? Or what that end product is? Basically for toothpaste and paints, white paints. So Australia is historically, and I didn't know this until I began investigating, historically a world leader in titanium oxide mining. We've done it in Australia for many years, and our companies are generally the lead companies doing that globally. Rio Tinto is a big Australian British mining company, does a lot of it, but also lots of these small bit players such as the one in Madagascar.
What about BHP?
BHP has been involved in it in South Africa, but they've pulled out, as BHP's tended to in recent years. So I thought, well, sorry about that.
It's your feelings.
That's right. So I thought, if there's this much action going on in Madagascar, one, is it happening in other countries, and two, are there problems associated with it? And as it turned out, both seem to be true. This here is really one of the first data points that emerged from our investigation. I spent with colleagues at ICIJ and with Eleanor about a year going through. Do I now get the excuse to use it? Try that. So we at ICIJ spent about a year doing very laborious desk work into company documents and reports, often 100 pages thick, to determine where are mining companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange or publicly traded, where are they doing business in Africa in the mining industry, how big is their presence, even in terms of kilometres or miles squared, and what controversies, what fatalities, what injuries are reported as a result of this activity. And this, you can see here, is one of the findings that we really brought to the public awareness for the first time. There'd been a very lackluster, I would even say lazy, attempt by Australian authorities to quantify the extent of mining companies in Africa from Australia. So ICIJ was really able to put on the map, literally and metaphorically, the presence of Australian mining companies in Africa. Yeah.
So that was about the time that Will, I think, started talking to me. I work for our domestic arm of the organisation. Within that umbrella lives the ICIJ. So I'm technically employed by the Centre for Public Integrity. We do a lot of deep dive investigative work, predominantly looking around the states and issues that affect Americans. So this was a real privilege to come and work in a very different environment on very different issues. It was a steep learning curve. Africa is not my speciality, so I was very much sort of thrown in and learnt a lot along the way. My specialty is multimedia journalism. So everything that you see, except for these graphics, who were produced by our fabulous news applications developer, Chris Zubatskis, he also built this. All of the other media in this presentation is predominantly filmed by me, and there's also a few photos in there by Will as well. That's not true. So one of the other things that when you think of mining players or the extractives industry, Australia may not necessarily jump to top of mind, but they're one of the countries with the longest history of mining. And as you can see here, they're actually the most numerous in Africa. I think perhaps the most notorious incident associated with an Australian mining company is what's referred to as the 2004 Kilwa massacre. That happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's when the DRC forces moved into a village after rebels had commandeered the town. The rebels did so peacefully, and there's been a lot of allegations that there was a completely disproportionate use of force to quell that presence. There's also been a lot of questions and allegations as to why. Now, there's an Australian company, or there was an Australian company operating there called Anvil Mining. When the rebels came in, they seized the port, shutting down, the company shut down production, and they also couldn't ship anything out while the rebels were there. So we're going to take you now to the Congo, and you'll meet a woman whose name is Adele, and she lost two of her children. So Colonel Adama, the individual mentioned at the bottom, he's known as the Butcher. He's got this lethal reputation and had worked with the company before in security matters. He's incredibly well known to them. He came in and the massacre followed over the course of the next couple of days. This is Adele.
Jordan. Jordan. Mpaka vile tu tunakuta watoto washafawa tunakuta masashi aina bo benye bali kufa bantu bamingi.
So she had fled into the trees. Her sons had stayed back, and they've never recovered the boys' bodies. So a lot of people were buried in mass graves. The UN came in the following days after the massacre. They reported, within their notes, are reports of hands sticking out of the ground. We interviewed one man in secret because at this point we had been assigned minders by the government. So we had to very quickly and surreptitiously find a place to interview him. And he reported being lined up and a whole bunch of people were summarily shot. Someone landed on him, pushing him into a mass grave where he stayed under mounted bodies until he felt it was safe to come out. This is an extreme example. 73 people were killed, and the links between the mine being there and what happened are of a lot of debate. Obviously, they're very contentious. But this is not something you would hear from Australian mining companies or Australian officials. The government's overall view about Australian companies moving into these kinds of countries, often developing countries and impoverished countries, is that will increase prosperity. I'll introduce you to Julie Bishop, who was then Foreign Minister.
Current foreign minister.
Sorry, and current Foreign Minister.
So we see a statement from Australia's Foreign Minister there, basically praising Australia's role as a trade power within Africa, which is really indicative of the one-eyed approach that I, and I think others who we interviewed for this project, felt that Australia had towards Africa. That idea that Australia can help the world's poorest continent develop, but what we found in our research and in our answers, or questions rather, to government, was that there was really no awareness or even attempt to understand what was happening on the other side of the coin. So that's what Eleanor and I did, and other journalists across Africa did, in speaking to people who will meet further today, people like Adele, victims of accidents on Australian-owned mine sites, as well as community members, lawyers who we spoke to. Just in terms of the Australian role in this, it's worth noting that the CEO of the mining company Anvil, which is still today involved in litigation or hopes of litigation that some of the survivors will receive compensation, that CEO is still the official chief executive officer of the Australian African Mining Industry Group, so the lobby group in Australia for Australian mining in Africa. So unsurprising therefore that both that lobby group and the government didn't want to comment on this particular project.
And just going back to this sort of what Will calls the one-eyed approach, it's a kind of tunnel vision, and that was also exemplified by the statements of another foreign minister from the other side of the aisle who said this.
I haven't seen an indictment of a big Australian company for reckless or socially irresponsible behaviour in a developing country.
So as an investigative journalist, a statement like that was a bit of a red flag to a bull, right? I basically said to myself, even after 1 or 2 weeks of cursory research, I'm not sure that entirely flies, and I'm not entirely sure you know what you're talking about there. So it was always his statement with his deep, infamous, gravelly voice, kind of pushing me on to see whether or not my suspicions that would undercut what he said were true, and that's what we set out about doing in the rest of this investigation. So examining that theory is really what we moved on to next, and was part of our purpose in travelling with Pulitzer Centre support to 4 different countries in Africa to visit individuals and communities where Australian mining had had a particularly devastating impact on the lives of locals or of particular workers. So what we found both through desk reporting, working with journalists across Africa, I had contacts with reporters in northern Ghana or in central Botswana who would go and have a coffee with a local prosecutor, and then once the internet worked a week later, be able to send me a scanned copy of an indictment charge by, in one particular case for example, an indictment paper by the Niger's prosecutor involving allegations that an Australian company had paid a $5 million bribe to a former president's son in order to secure a uranium mine. So through my own desk research and that of ICIJ, working with local journalists, and ultimately through our travelling to Africa to speak with these people who we don't often see, we were able to document, again for the first time, these kind of grievances that go from the extreme to the massacre and killer, of course, to court battles, for example, in Burkina Faso, where hundreds of workers at an Australian-owned gold mine alleged that they had been unfairly and summarily dismissed. And we were able to gain primary evidence and first-hand materials attesting to this, because, as I'm sure you know or can imagine, and as we might discuss later, mining and mining controversies are not a new thing, right? You can look online any old day of the week and see hundreds of complaints, some of which are well-founded, some of which aren't. But there's a lot of, I suppose, noise in this space of mining and human rights, mining and community rights. What we wanted to do as investigative journalists was to push through that noise and find documented cases and examples in which we could really point our finger and ask detailed questions of those in power.
And of course, some of that is talking to people on the ground. So as well as the people we spoke to when we travelled there, Will has spent thousands of hours, and when we've spent time together speaking to people. And one of them was Tracy Davies, who is a lawyer, an environmentalist and a lawyer in South Africa, and has been following Australia's footprint there for a very long time. And this is what she had to say.
There is a very strong perception that Australian mining companies come here to get away with the things that they wouldn't get away with in Australia.
And that's certainly something that we found to be true in the course of our research.
And a term that particularly came up, well, to speak to this in the immediate, this is, again, a desk-based tally that ICIJ was able to do of the number of fatalities linked to publicly traded Australian mining companies. So colleagues of mine and I spent eye-watering hours looking at page 87 of a 163-page annual report, just for the one line of a company that would say, unfortunately, during the past financial year, we regret to announce the death of one person who died when a crane fell on him at a well in a coal mine, for example. So things that often weren't even relayed in the news, sometimes weren't relayed on filings on the Australian Stock Exchange, and sometimes that we really just had to pull out of a document that about 3 people had probably consulted. So we assembled this total list of 380 or more because we wanted to be on the conservative side and the legally safe side when it came to confronting mining companies of deaths attributable either directly or indirectly to Australian mining activity across Africa.
Yeah, I think you were going to say something about perception.
I was. A word that came up with Tracy and many others very often was this term of cowboys. Australia doesn't really have a history of cowboys so much as bushrangers, but I think the concept works. To go back to the Congo example, the Australian company Anvil was the first one, right in the middle of the DRC civil war, that decided, bugger it. There's a lot of copper in Congo, and we're going to go and make money from it, even if there are risks that the civil war is going to put our work and our profits in jeopardy. So this cowboy mentality is one that Australians are often associated with across Africa, from Congo to South Africa. What Tracy, the lawyer, would often tell us was that she's often going to court against small, junior, minor Australian mining companies, and that in her mind explained the perception that they were behaving in ways that they wouldn't be able to do so if they were major mining companies in better regulated nations.
Always, what we seek to do as journalists is put human experience behind figures like this. It's that old thing, 1,000 people dead is a statistic and one person is a tragedy. And to seek out these stories, we need to obviously be on the ground, be talking to networks of people. And we found a man named Caldwell Sachinga who worked for the first the first mine in Malawi, full stop. They happened to mine uranium, and he was involved in a really tragic accident where two of his colleagues were killed. He was cleaning out a tank with a highly volatile chemical called MEK. We've had US experts here tell us that he was using far too much of this chemical in a confined space, so the conditions in which he was working were dangerous, if not potentially lethal in the first place. Added to that was the fact that there was an open flame nearby, which of course flouts every regulation, both here in Australia and in Malawi. Two of his colleagues were killed, as I mentioned, and he was very badly burned.
It was like a bomb. So I can't even remember because I was half dead. Starting from here is all skin graft. All skin graft. Or if you can see, skin graft on the head here. This wound will not heal until the rest of my life, as I was told by the specialist who did this.
So I was actually called by Mr. Sachinga Sunday around 2 a.m, but I called him back on Monday, basically asking me for an update. He's in a situation now where 6 years after the accident in 2009, he has not been able to receive any formal compensation through the Malawian courts. He has been able to subsist off a stipend that the company, while never admitting legal liability, has decided that it's generous enough in spirit to offer. He fears that when the company leaves the country, as it apparently intends to do at the end of the month, he'll no longer have access to medication. As I mentioned, Paladin, who we engaged with quite rigorously, I would say, on his particular case, wrote back to us, I think, a very detailed answer in response to about 25 questions that we posed based on Mr. Sachinga's case and other issues, stating, as you can see here, that there's no legal liability from their end in terms of the accident and therefore any obligations that they owe him. Although I would note, interestingly, that Mr. Sachinga told us that the day after our story came out in Malawi, a very nice, clean, white 4x4 car rode up to his house, and he was, in no uncertain terms, kind of upbraided for having spoken to journalists so publicly about his condition. But the fact remains that this is now a man who, in his mid-30s, has no more chance of earning a living, and to support a wife and 5 children is going to remain a real challenge for them.
Not to mention he can't even go outside because of the extent of his full body burns, which means that he can't produce crops or anything like that, the sort of things that he would have done prior to this incident. What's really interesting here is that although he worked on the Paladin site. He was never technically an employee of the company. And that's something we saw especially in South Africa, where there was a shift by Australian companies to using huge numbers of contract labour. And that's something that raises some of the issues that we found in Malawi, but a whole suite of other things as well. So we went there and we looked at a company called Aquarius, and they operate in the Platinum Belt. So you can literally stand in one spot and do a circle, and you'll just see mine after mine after mine. This company has since reduced its contract labour somewhat, but it still employs a lot of people who are technically employed by another company. I'm going to introduce you to a man named Norman Tabelli. He lives just across the street from the mine. You can practically see the mine from his house. And this is him. No, it's not. This is another man who was injured on that mine. We'll hear from Norman.
Man don't want to be blamed. They will go all the route to find someone being responsible. That is the case that we most experience as the worker. For every accident, you'll find that the worker is guilty.
And this is where Norman lives. So there's 15 people that use that toilet.
My friend, is very complex. The safety of Australia is very excellent. I wish that could be applied on the Aquarius mine. What makes people to experience this injury? People are waiting for bonuses, because sometimes bonus is more than our salary. You see, that is the whole thing that is missing everything. That is the thing that makes things rough in mine. We'll just go there to make it quick and fast, because we want our bonus. We want to push the bonus. The miners don't care about the safety. What we care about is the production. How far the production goes, because it's where his money.
So while it might sound like we gave Mr. Tabelli a script to read so that he could say, we wish that mine safety conditions in South Africa were as good as they were in Australia, we actually didn't. That's something that he came out with himself. But it really does reflect a consciousness that we found among many miners, especially in South Africa, who perceived, as many of you will know if you follow the news about South African mining labour conditions and protests, that it's a country that, like many mineral-rich nations across Africa, should be wealthy, but for various reasons isn't. Norman we approached, and this whole mine we approached, really through an investigative journalism, data-driven angle, in that Aquarius Mine is a company that's not very well known. It's one of the smaller ones. It's only got 2 or 3 mines in South Africa, so it's not particularly important. But based on data analysis we'd done, we were able to find out that despite its small size, it had one of the highest number of fatalities across its mining operations. And armed with that knowledge, we were both able to go and interview people who worked there, who could speak to us about why that might be the case, but also usefully put that to the mining company itself, which had never done that kind of tally, and I remember was rather unprepared for responses in that regard when we were able to meet them. That company, to its credit, was the only one that was willing to meet us in person and discuss our questions face to face. And again, what interested us in the South Africa case, as in many of the cases across Africa, was what is the difference, if there is any, between how a mine worker in Africa would be treated there and how an Australian mine worker would be treated. Australia, at least until recently, has been very famous for the quality and the wonders of its mining industry. Well-paid jobs, protections. It's the motor that's driven the Australian economy for years. And similar statistics and praise, I suppose, is available in terms of how mining workers are treated when they are injured. Australia does, by the way, have, I think, the lowest, if not the second lowest, if not the lowest, mining fatality rate standardised across all Western mining nations as well, so much lower than America's. But we did simple comparisons. In Australia.
In Australia.
We would do comparisons. For example, in one case in Australia where there's one death, all kinds of governments jump on board for inquiries and investigations. They spend 14 months going through thousands of documents and conducting over 100 interviews. In the case of Coldwell Sichinga in Malawi, or in other cases where we interviewed families who had lost relatives in South African mine collapses, there certainly wasn't that level of political or regulatory engagement, or if there was no way that they were going to tell journalists about it. I remember one particular example, I spent about 6 months trying to process a 50-cent Freedom of Information requests through South Africa for information about a fatal injury, and after 4 months I simply gave up because there was no way that I was able to get that 50-cent fee processed, and there was no way that I was going to get any information out of them.
Does anyone have any questions at this point? We've only got a little bit left, but if you've missed anything or you want to jump in at any point, sure.
Are there any treaties that would apply through which you could get some results?
In terms of...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, are there any treaties that could apply, bilateral treaties that would apply, say, between Australia and nations in Africa that could assist, I imagine, victims or workers? Or...
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was going to say the Canadians actually debated some legislation around that kind of thing, to have the power to monitor the overseas operations of the companies that are listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange. It was brought up in Australia. It didn't even get to the point where it was tabled in the Parliament. So they're really, whether it's at a sort of international bilateral agreement level or even domestically with this sort of arm to reach out, that's just not happening.
And it is a problem in that while there might be lots of Australian mining companies in Africa, we have a very, very weak diplomatic presence across the region. Australia has, I think, a similar diplomatic equivalent in terms of number of embassies worldwide to Iceland. So there aren't many Australian embassies in these countries. We have an honorary consul in Malawi, but guess who that honorary consul is? Guess who is Australia's official representative in Malawi? It's the very man who responded to our allegations about worker mistreatment.
Is there an equivalent in Australia equivalent to the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act?
There is a similar provision, although it's not as strong as the FCPA. Is there an equivalent in Australia to the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? There is a Corruption Act, which we were interested and talked to lawyers in Australia about exploring. They all acknowledge that it's never happened yet, and it's going to be very difficult for Australia to introduce proceedings that would rely on a similar kind of provision in Australia.
Of course, it's not just workers. I'll grab your question in a moment. It's not just workers. As you saw from Adele, the woman who lost her children in the Kilwa massacre, communities are affected by this presence. It's not just a direct relationship with employees. The impact of these companies in communities is profound. We went to Mali, where mining is not a new thing. They've been mining gold there for centuries, and it looks a little bit like this. Well, this is it. Basically, practices haven't changed that much. This was down basically what was a river for a road. We went and we found a shanty town where people had constructed makeshift accommodation out of tree branches and plastic, black trash bag plastic. And this was a thriving community. There was commerce happening. There was a lot of international trade because you had, there was trade between the international community because a lot of people were crossing borders to come and mine this gold directly themselves. Very different story down the road. This is Syama mine, and it's Mali's oldest industrial mine. There has been a lot of controversy about this mine too. Complaints began fairly early on. It's a sort of, this particular community has custodial land rights, so there isn't a title deed to your farming land. You've just used it for generations upon generations, which means when the mine wants to expand, they are just allowed to do that. People complain that they weren't given compensation. Another complaint we heard a lot is that they weren't given the jobs they were promised. So workers from surrounding countries would come in as opposed to the local populace being employed. And this basically bubbled up, and then in 2012 local villagers blocked the road. The women sat down with soup ladles effectively and wouldn't let anyone in or out of the mine, and the police were called and things went very badly indeed.
Wonderful.
Next. So this was the third time as well. What's interesting here is you have an allegation of direct involvement from the mine, calling the police to disperse the protesters.
Baraji kelen filɛ yan min tun ye banaso sira ye baraji kelen filɛ yan o tun ye furu sira ye baraji kelen filɛ yan o ye siyama sira ye an jɔlen o baraji kɔfɛ yan donc o nana ka na mugu ci an na an sera ka minnu tɔmɔ minnu donna bin na olu ko tɛ dɛ minnu tora sira kan n'an y'olu ye an y'olu de tɔmɔ olu bɛnna 99 ma.
So this was one of these examples that officially didn't exist. It was never declared by the mining company because legally, according to the mining company's version of events, it didn't happen within the official confines of the mine site and was a civil matter between communities and police. But according to people we interviewed, documents that we saw, and even the head of the gendarme sections in Mali there, the altercation was a direct result of protests against the Australian mine and because the Australian mining company called in police and asked them to unblock the road. I think that's pretty much where we're going to leave it now that we've covered issues to do with workers, communities, kind of data that was behind it, as well as the travel that we were able to do there due to the Pulitzer Centre. So I think we were just going to leave it open to questions in case people had any, or boos and hisses.
I think you're first, sir.
Well, thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. For the sake of comparison, how do local companies treat their miners and as compared to Australian, or international companies such as Rheingold or Anglo-American, because they probably have, a higher fatality rate. In South Africa, the mines tend to be 2 or 3 kilometers, deep, and more likely to have accident than surface mining. Have you investigated all that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That non-Australian or other mining companies in Africa by no means have necessarily a better record. Our interest as investigative journalists was, I think at least in part, saying, okay, well there are great studies out there by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations, other journalists who've looked at Canadian miners in Africa. They've looked at
Chinese company.
Chinese companies in Africa is a very big theme. But for whatever reason, either because we all want to perpetuate the myth that Australians are just full of a land of koalas and surfboards, or for whatever else, there'd been no real systematic attempt, or because Australian journalists were lazy, there'd never been a systematic attempt before to look at another big player in the field.
Sorry. I also think it's because they're, more often than not, they're the junior companies. So to be honest, no one's really looking at that section of the industry. It's the BHPs and that kind of size company that gets a lot of attention. And these things are far more well documented than the way that these Australian sort of bit players are doing business and the kind of impact that they're having.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the government regulation? I was interested in that graphic of the courthouse with the 3 branches of government, and we talked about Malawi, but
I'm not familiar with Congo's legislation when it comes to workplace
or the President Kabila.
accident. Or
It might be worth talking about the Kilwa massacre court proceedings.
yeah, I mean, I suppose the best example would be what happened in Kilwa after that massacre there. There was a United Nations investigation that led to, albeit under duress, the Congolese government instituting a military tribunal that, for no good reason, at least in the minds of international lawyers, also accused 3 mining company executives at the time, which was rather unexpected. They were all cleared of wrongdoing during this military tribunal. That's largely because, for example, the prosecutor and the judges actually stated in their judgment that even people like Adele had not suffered any loss and that her children presumably just didn't feel like coming home, or they'd been killed because, I think one judge said, your son was going out to collect his pair of jeans, and if he wanted his jeans so much, he must have therefore been a part of the rebels, and therefore his death was part of a conflict. So there was a very, very shoddy, dismissive military tribunal. The company was also listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Legal proceedings were launched in Toronto, which actually went up to the Supreme Court, but then which ultimately failed. And then Australia has been somewhat absent. Last year, in fact the year before, as we were reporting this story, we were in touch with lawyers representing Adele who were hoping they could just squeeze in before the statute of limitations hit and institute proceedings in Australia, but to my knowledge, that never happened.
And to sort of, well, this is up. To further illustrate the sort of level of disregard that they had for these people, this community wasn't allowed to acknowledge that this massacre had occurred. There was no public mourning, which is a sort of cultural right within this part of the Congo. No one was allowed to rebury anyone. And then there is this sort of veil of secrecy that you feel when you're there. As I mentioned before, we were taken into a room by intelligence services who asked us a lot of questions and decided that they should probably keep an eye on us, and then asked us to pay for a minder to follow us around. Looking at the videos and things from the trial, some of which is included in this presentation if you're interested, they didn't get the names of the victims and the families right. They would refer to the mining executives by their first names, and there's the allegations around judges giving the right verdict. It was a predetermined conclusion that cleared the mine and all the armed forces of any wrongdoing whatsoever.
There's another question there.
I just have a question. What made you decide, was it part of this Pulitzer project that to decide to use all the multimedia and the videos? And your participants or the people you interviewed, do you think they reacted differently to if you had just had a normal interview without video?
Yeah, and that's something, so we, as an investigative news organisation, we work primarily in print, or text, I should say now, because we're digital only, we're digital first. But then there's stories like this that have a really visual element, have a real human element. And, you know, as an organisation, and certainly that's why Will approached me to come on board and work with him on this, because there's something that you can capture by being there. And I think hearing a lot of foreign names and seeing a lot of foreign faces, seeing a lot of foreign black faces, immediately puts this wall between us sitting here in America and the people who are really experiencing this. I think this helps to sort of break down a lot of those barriers and helps people empathize, perhaps. And with regard to how people act, they always act differently in front of a camera. You think, you know, when you even listening to yourself on your voicemail, you cringe, right? You feel self-conscious about it. And that's true of people when you point a camera at them as well. Then there's the fact that you've just got these sort of logistical issues. You know, it just, and we'll sort of attest to this, it just takes a lot longer to collect this kind of media than it does to quietly sit with a person in their house, not worrying about lighting, not worrying about sound, not worrying about whether the kids are running in and out, or whether there's a chicken or a rooster, you know, going off in the background, that kind of thing. So I think, you know, it means that you probably can't do quite as much in some respects. And I think one thing it does mean, though, is that the people who participate really want their stories told. They, you know, there's no sort of like, oh, I don't imagine this will end up anywhere. You know, my camera is about yay big. You know, I've got tripods and in some instances lights and things like that. So, you know, as uncomfortable as they can feel, it's really a matter of, you know, we want our stories out there. We don't want to sort of languish here when no one's listening to us and no one's aware.
I have two questions actually. So the first is, you know, you spoke about this women protesting and then, you know,